a a big thank you to our funder, Wildlife Habitat Canada, for making continued wetlands education like these webinars possible. Today we are joined by Corey Tull and Kyle Visvanathan, who will be kind of shedding light on how BC's water and watersheds are being pushed to the brink and why watershed security and modern industrial water rates must be a critical priority in BC. This webinar is our most recent addition to our Wetlands Institute speaker series, which spans back to 2021 and covers a variety of topics in watershed restoration and conservation. And if you want to go back and view any previous webinars, all those recordings can be found on the BCWF Watershed Team's YouTube channel. We are hosting a second webinar as part of the 2026 edition of this series. That's on February 18th. And it's going to be covering the coexistence of wetlands and agriculture and looking at a current project that we're doing at Glen Valley Farm in Abbotsford, BC. You can register for that if you're interested through the link that Alana has sent in the chat. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. As we work and live across what is known as British Columbia, I would like to acknowledge and show my respect for the Indigenous peoples who have lived in relationship with and stewarded these lands since time immemorial and continue to do so today. Today, I'm joining this webinar from the BC Wildlife Federation's office on the unceded ancestral, traditional, and contemporary territories of the Semiahmoo, Stolo, Wasaniach, Kwantlen, Chematus, and Hulkaminam Treaty Group nations in what is commonly known as Surrey, BC. I would also like to acknowledge that our attendees may be joining from many places near and far and acknowledge and appreciate the traditional caretakers of those lands. As we're all joining today's webinar from different locations, I do encourage you to spend some time learning about the First Nations whose territories we are privileged to live on and visit. And I know I'm deeply appreciative that we were able to meet together and learn on their territories. So quickly, a little bit about the BC Wildlife Federation, who is your host for this webinar. We are a member-based charitable organization with a mission to protect and enhance the environment for present and future generations. We're driven by core values of stewardship, transparency, and science-based solutions. Our origins date back to the 1890s when volunteer conservationists established fish and game protective associations that formed the basis of our current member clubs. And our members, partners, as well as staff work together to preserve the natural beauty of BC through education, partnerships, and responsible outdoor activities. Like I said, we are a registered charity and a member-based organization, and by becoming a member of the BC Wildlife Federation or one of our affiliated clubs, you can contribute to advocacy and on-the-ground stewardship, as well as independent research and gain access to member-exclusive discounts, benefits, as well as liability insurance and a lot more. Our member fees also help fund incredibly vital administrative components of our on-the-ground restoration and enhancement initiatives that many of our grant funders unfortunately do not cover. It is $65 for a single membership or $95 for a family. Or if you join one of our affiliated clubs, you automatically become a member of the organization. And so if you're interested and want to learn more, you can go to bcwf.bc.ca/membership, and that link is on the screen. So as I mentioned, I'm the coordinator for our Wetlands Education Program, which is a program under the BC Wildlife Federation's Watershed team. And we are a department within the broader organization, and we do a lot of work in conservation and stewardship, and we focus our work under three core elements. So the first one, our education programs. Our watershed team is enhancing grassroots and community-driven conservation efforts and promoting watershed health across the province. Since 2010, our wetlands education program and our fish habitat restoration and education program have trained over 6,000 youth and adult participants in conservation and restoration and has completed over 77 watershed restoration and enhancement projects, restoring around 245 hectares. Our restoration projects, these often involve collaboration with various partners, including First Nations, environmental NGOs, and private landowners. In the past 5 years, our team has supported over 35 restoration projects, improving over 197 hectares of wetland and floodplain habitat. And then our last core element are conservation tools. These include key initiatives such as the Wetlands Ecosystem Services Protocol, which is a tool that helps us standardize how we assess the health and function of wetlands. And another tool we have is our Wetland Plants of BC Guidebook, which is a field guide detailing indicator species for wetland classification. This guide is a free resource. It's available for digital download or in print format through our website, which Alana will also share a link to in our chat. It's a super cool book, and if you don't have a copy of the resource yet, I would definitely recommend checking it out. If you do have an idea for a wetland project or you're looking for watershed education in your community, you're always welcome to reach out to us. We're always keen to create more partnerships and see where we can all work together to create healthy watersheds. And then if you're interested in learning more about our organization or our team, you can visit our website, bcwfwatershedteam.ca, and subscribe to get updates whenever we upload new content, or you can find us on social media. And it's with support from people like you that we continue to make strong progress in 2025 to restore and protect fish and wildlife habitats across the province. The need to protect BC's watersheds continues to grow, which we'll talk about today in this webinar, and funding streams are tightening. So if you're able, we do invite you to support this work by donating to help carry this momentum forward. Your support helps ensure we can continue restoring the places that fish, wildlife, and communities depend on. And the winter season is an amazing time for the conservation community. It's a time to get together, share knowledge, education, and new ideas. So if you are interested in continuing to learn more about the world around you and how you can be a better steward, I encourage you to check out more webinars on topics that may interest you. I've put a few upcoming webinars on this slide, including our upcoming webinar on wetlands and agriculture, and a related webinar from the Langley Environmental Partners Society called Scoop and Poop, which I think is a fun title. It's talking about the role of things like scat and manure on our ecosystems and nutrient cycle. These will all be shared in the chat as well, because I know it's a lot to read on just one slide. And lastly, before I introduce you to our speakers, I just wanted to make sure we're all set up for success. So we are using Zoom today, and we will have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. So please submit your questions through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you do not see a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, look for 3 dots that will open a larger menu where you'll be able to find the Q&A icon. Feel free also to use the chat if you want to let us know where you're calling in from, maybe share any comments or resources that you're aware of. And for those who would like, there is also a closed caption button that you can use to turn on subtitles for your device. And then last thing, I promise the last thing, before we get started, at the end of the webinar, when it closes, there will be a quick survey that pops up on your screen. It's only a couple questions. It should take you like less than a minute to fill out. Your feedback does help us improve our programming and is crucial to support our grant writing and applications and reports. So if you could take a few minutes to fill that out, we would be extremely grateful. Okay, and with all that said, I am very excited to introduce our 2 speakers for today. So Corey Tull is a community organizer, advocate, and watershed strategist. She is the chair of the BC Watershed Security Coalition, director of government relations and engagement for BC Water Legacy, and a steering committee member for the Working for Watersheds Initiative and the Canadian Coalition for Healthy Waters. With over 15 years of experience, Corey has led issue-based and electoral campaigns that raise public awareness and engage communities in shaping policy and decisions that impact social, economic, and environmental well-being. Corey holds a Bachelor of Technology in Ecological Restoration from the British Columbia Institute of Technology, a Bachelor of Arts in Geography and International Relations from the University of British Columbia, and a certificate in Community Economic Development from Simon Fraser University. And then our other speaker, Kyle Visvanathan, is a Secretariat member of the Watershed Security Coalition and a project associate with the BC Water Legacy. He's a recent graduate of the University of British Columbia's Masters of Public Policy and Global Affairs program, where he focused on youth participation in water governments in rural Ecuador. So prior to that, he spent 4 years running student organizing campaigns and managing programs that empower young people to participate in our democracy. So I don't know about you, but I'm really excited to learn from the two of you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we'll let you guys share so we can get started.
All right. I think we're set up and ready to go here. Perfect. Thank you, Erica, very much for that introduction. And yeah, we so appreciate the opportunity to be here. As Erica mentioned, my name is Corey Tull. I'm the chair of the BC Watershed Security Coalition, and I'm joining you today from the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish people. And I offer my respect to their people, past and present. And I'm very fortunate to have my colleague Kyle joining us today. So I'll just quickly let Kyle introduce himself.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Kyle Visvanathan. I'm a secretariat member, as was mentioned. Use he, him pronouns, and yeah, very excited to talk about the industrial water rates in BC today.
Great, thanks, Kyle. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. We got a good discussion ahead, and we're looking forward to questions at the end. And so today we'll talk a little bit about just who are we, the BC Watershed Security Coalition, and we'll talk a bit about like why watershed security matters in this moment in our province. And then this opportunity to generate new revenue for watershed security work and projects and management, and then dig in a little bit around some recommendations and next steps with this broader conversation that we're having today. So diving right into it. So the BC Watershed Security Coalition, we bring together over 57 organizations from, experts in the field to farmers, Indigenous champions, local governments, community water leaders, and collectively we represent more than 285,000 British Columbians. And we all have come together and continue to choose to come together to drive solutions that really recognize healthy watersheds as the foundation of our health and our economy and climate readiness across BC. And so when we, do presentations like this, I always love to be able to start by defining what watershed security means to us, and when we talk about it, what it means for our communities and for our province. And so watershed security is really about access to clean drinking water, basic human right. It's healthy fish populations, thriving local economies with good jobs that allow people to stay in their communities. And this supports strong partnerships between governments to enable better watershed decision making and resilient communities that come from this partnership, collaboration, and decision making, allowing these communities to really withstand the increasing risks of droughts and wildfires and floods that our communities are facing. And so this is about protecting, the watersheds that sustain our way of life, socially, culturally, and economically across BC. So unfortunately, and many of you have experienced this and are experiencing this firsthand, but we're seeing decades of watershed degradation, poorly planned development, and land use decisions, from clear-cut logging to urban expansion. And this has really weakened our watersheds, and climate change is now turning these vulnerabilities from our degraded watersheds into some real world disasters. We're seeing communities on the front line who are stuck in this like, cycle of crisis. And so we see drought, which, creates the conditions for more intense wildfires, which then strip the vegetation from our watersheds, resulting in more devastating floods and landslides. And then we have communities who are left responding to these emergencies without the resources and the tools to get ahead and prevent or minimize the impacts of these crises. And then that cycle of crises starts again. And we find ourselves in these situations where, people are being asked, to take shorter showers or keep an evacuation bag, by the door, but this isn't a plan. And this often shifts the burden onto families, onto British Columbians, onto local communities, instead of fixing the systems that are failing them to be able to get ahead, plan, manage, and make better decisions to prevent these crises in the first place. And so watershed security is how we can move from reacting to these crises and preventing them. And one of the great things is like we know this approach works, and when we invest in watershed security, it allows us to move out of this constant state of emergency response, supporting good jobs within the watershed workforce. That's a really major economic sector in the province. And so, one of the things that we've learned through our work, and the Working for Watersheds initiative released this report and a roadmap that was able to identify that BC's watershed sector is much bigger than most people realize. And the work of keeping our watersheds healthy supports more than 47,000 direct and indirect jobs across BC. And it contributes more than $5 billion in GDP annually. And so, this puts the watershed sector on par with mining, oil and gas, and it's larger than agriculture. And so one of the things that's amazing about this is that these are local place-based jobs that are strengthening and future-proofing BC's communities and economy right now. And so back in 2021 and 2022, we saw some very targeted investments into watershed security, which really demonstrated what's possible when this is a priority. And so we saw the province invest $57 million through programs like the Healthy Watersheds Initiative and the Indigenous Watersheds Initiative. And this supported more than 100 community projects, and it created more than 1,800 frontline watershed jobs. And this work and these projects improved climate resilience, improved public safety, food security, and salmon habitat. And, BC Wildlife Federation and the watershed team are a really great example of what is possible when these investments are directed into communities and into our watersheds, and what we can achieve on the ground. And so, we saw momentum continuing at the provincial level. And in 2023, there was the creation of the Watershed Security Fund, which was through a $100 million endowment. And that fund is being co-developed with First Nations. And this is a really important step towards the longer term sustainable funding that's needed to support critical watershed work across the province. But it is an endowment, and because it's $100 million, it only generates $3 to $5 million a year right now. So that's far short of what's needed. And we know that the amount of annual funding that needs to be invested into communities has to grow significantly. Experts are recommending between $75 to $100 million annually is sort of that baseline. And so instead of building on sort of this momentum and training and jobs, annual funding for watershed work has dropped by roughly 80% from the province since 2023. And so this is leaving communities under-resourced as these climate disasters are increasing. And we're seeing these major industrial projects that are now being expedited and fast-tracked, and often in communities that are already quite water stressed. But this is where we can flip the script, and we know that there's a fair and a really simple opportunity to generate revenue to fund this critical work. And so I'm going to hand it over to Kyle to dig into this a little bit more.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. And so yeah, that's where we come in. Last October, as the BC Watershed Security Coalition, we released our report titled Modernizing Industrial Water Rates in BC, Ending the Great Water Giveaway. And it really shows how the province could generate new revenue for this amazing critical watershed work, and all without costing or like adding costs to taxpayers. And so in our report, we identified two main disconnects in BC's water rate system as it is currently. And before we kind of dig into that, I want to just like take a step back and ensure that we're all on the same page of understanding what we mean by water rates, or what water rates are. And so the province recognizes that water is a shared public resource that you can't own. But you can pay a fee, which authorizes you to withdraw or rent a certain amount of water from a river or lake or aquifer for a specific purpose. And so I think the key here is that this is different from your residential or households kind of water, like what you pay for water, because that's treated water for drinking and for sewage, whereas kind of these industrial water rates that we talk about, or just the fees for taking water directly from the source. And so now going back to these kind of two disconnects, the first disconnect in our report that we found is that essentially no money generated off of our watersheds are used to preserve them. And so in BC, the revenue collected from water rates generates about $400 million a year for the province. And yeah, you can see this in like the dark blue parts of the graph. And as new hydro projects come online, and I think Site C is an example of this, the revenue generated from water rates are forecasted to add another $200 million over the next 3 years. And we can see this with the light blue parts of the graph. And so most of this revenue comes from hydro projects. Actually, only 3% of this revenue comes from industrial users. And so, even though this sounds like a really small, like industrial water rate sounds like a really small portion of the overall water related revenue, it's actually still like a lot of water. So in BC, industries are authorized to withdraw 2.8 trillion, yes, that's a T, trillion liters of water every year. And that's 5 times more than all the water that, households in BC use per year. So a lot of water. And so, again, this key problem is almost all of this revenue just goes back into just general government revenue, and nearly none of it goes back into ensuring the health and management of the watersheds that kind of generate these funds for the province. And so, going to disconnect two to add, salt to the wound, BC also has some of the lowest industrial water rates in the country. BC last reviewed water rates back in 2014. And, for the rest of us, the price of everything seems to be going up, but the price for water for industry has stayed the same for the last decade. And so industrial users like mining companies or fracking and water bottling companies in BC, they pay at most $2.25 for 1 million liters. And for some industrial uses, they pay even as low as $1.30 for 1 million liters. And so I know for me, I have a hard time kind of thinking or understanding how much 1 million liters is. And so to put it in perspective, that's like leaving your kitchen tap running just like nonstop, continuously for 6 months straight, and only paying the price of like a double double or like a coffee for that all that water. And so by comparison, other provinces, as we can kind of see on this graph, other provinces charge 20 to 80 times more for their industrial water use. And even more so, the rate for water bottling companies in Quebec and Ontario, it's the kind of premium part of the graph here. In Quebec and Ontario, water bottling companies are charged more than 22,000% higher than what they are in BC. And so I know to me, I think what this graph shows is that compared to other provinces, BC is like effectively giving away a really vital public resource for essentially nothing to some of the world's kind of largest industries. And so, in our report, we looked at how much could be generated if BC were to catch up with all these other provinces and apply their industrial water rate here in BC. And so, by fairly modernizing industrial water rates to match these other provinces, BC can generate over $100 million, which could then be used to invest back in the watershed security projects that Corey was talking about, and just reinvest back into better water management across the province.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm gonna dig in a bit deeper and look at some examples here in BC. So right now in BC, the top 10 largest industrial water users, and this excludes pulp and paper, are licensed to take over 500 billion liters of water each year. And so for that, they pay less than $1 million total, so just over $800,000. And so I just want to be clear, this isn't about blame. I think what this is telling us is that water is deeply undervalued. in our province, and it reveals a system that no longer reflects fairness or today's water insecurity realities that communities are facing. Um, and I think it's important for us to note that many of these same companies that are operating in BC also operate in other provinces, which have much higher water rates. And these companies have been able to adapt without harming their competitiveness. And so we just have an example here of Rio Tinto. So they use roughly the same amount of water in BC as they do in Quebec, about 80 billion liters. And in BC, they pay just under $200,000, and in Quebec, they pay around $3 million. So it just helps to put this all into perspective. Uh, one of the things that is raised when we have these conversations around the opportunity to raise or modernize industrial water rates and do this in a fair way is about, okay, well, what about economic competitiveness? Is this going to put some of these companies or projects at risk? And so let's dig in on that a little bit deeper with an example around Teck Highland Valley Copper Mine. And so we were able to look at the public operation costs for this particular project in BC. And if we were to apply Quebec's lowest industrial water rate to the license that Teck Highland Valley Copper Mine has, the rate in which, or the cost, sorry, I should say, for water that they pay would raise from 0.01% of their total operating costs to just 0.2% of total operating costs. So this is like a very small fraction, well below material thresholds, which is sort of what companies would refer to as, a threshold that would affect a decision on their bottom line. So it's well below that. And so it just tells us and it shows us very clearly that fairly modernizing water rates for industry in BC is practical. And it's important, I think, for us to just acknowledge that water is essential for every industry, these industries as well, and as demand is growing, and we are seeing these increased stresses in our communities, we have to make sure that we can reflect, how the impact on our watersheds and that the health and management of our watersheds can continue to support the economic growth in the direction that we're going in the province. And so, bringing rates in line with other provinces and reinvesting that revenue into the health of our watershed benefits our communities, but it also benefits these industries, and it reduces risk and uncertainty, and it stabilizes operations, and it protects jobs, and it helps keep local communities safe from these increasing crises that we're seeing. And so one of the great things since October when we launched our report, and we've been out having conversations with the public and with decision makers in community in Victoria, and we're seeing growing support and momentum around this opportunity to generate revenue for watershed security. And 82% of BC residents support higher industrial water fees as a tool to fund better watershed security, better water management, watershed restoration work. We saw the BC Finance Committee recently recommend as a part of their budget process to review water rates and how they align with other provinces, and to explore dedicating portions of revenue to strengthen water management and drinking water protection in BC. Just most recently, we're seeing momentum continue to grow from local decision makers. The Union of BC Municipalities Convention just passed a resolution calling on the province to also raise rates and dedicate that new revenue, and an open letter signed by 47 local elected officials was recently just sent to the Premier and key ministers, calling for the similar commitment and priority around watershed security in the province. So all of this is just like continuing to reflect that BC making watershed security, the health of our watersheds and our communities a priority, and catching up with other provinces around the rates in which we're charging for our industrial water is fair, it's fiscally responsible, and it's supported by the public and experts. And so, it's just a practical way that we can protect our watersheds for generations to come. And so in our report, we had sort of two key recommendations. And so the first is about the opportunity for the province to generate new revenue by modernizing BC's industrial water rates, match other provinces, and also to commit to reviewing these rates every year and looking at, applying a consumer price index onto that review to make sure that those rates are staying in alignment with the increases of other rates and costs. And this can be done, through an expert panel. And then the second, which I think is a very important part of this process and of our recommendations, but it's that, the province can generate new revenue, but the key piece is that we need to see that revenue or parts of that revenue dedicated back into the health of our watersheds and the management of our watersheds that is generating that revenue in order to meet the scale of need to ensure long-term sustainable funding across the province. And so this can be done, by allocating, we recommended 20% of existing water revenue back into watershed security, and then 75 million in new water revenue, into growing the Watershed Security Fund, an existing funding mechanism that can support this work. And then part of that investment into watershed security can also fund a province-wide system of watershed boards to really support communities and nations and key stakeholders to do that coordinated watershed planning, share data, manage sort of water use at the basin level, and be able to respond rapidly to crises, when they happen, once they've been able to do that planning ahead of time. So that's sort of our research. That's the key findings of our report and our recommendations and the work that we're doing. So thank you for listening and joining us today. And Kyle and I are happy to answer questions and have more of a discussion. So I haven't looked at the Q&A, so maybe there's questions there already. So I'll open that up, but we'll go there now.
I was still muted. Thank you so much, Corey and Kyle. If you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A or put them in the chat. If you would like to say your questions out loud, because some people do prefer that, you can, raise your hand and we'll let you do that as well. Let me just change some settings here. One moment. I might start off with a question myself. I always like to ask any speakers if they had to take everything that they just spent talking about and make an elevator pitch to somebody, what that elevator pitch would be. I think these are issues that matter most to me, but I think if I was to go home and have dinner with my father right now, who cares about very different things than I do, and I had to explain to him, why should we be investing in watershed security when, people are struggling to put food on the table? What should I say to him in his attention span that lasts about, it's very short.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great question. And I think that the message is that, the health of our watersheds and the strength of our economy are directly linked, and they really underpin the health and the prosperity of our communities in our province right now. And as costs continue to go up, to put food on the table, to keep a house, a safe place, over your head, and to make sure that people can stay in their communities with good jobs that can support their families, we have to ensure that we have strong functioning watersheds that allow this to happen. We can't buy local food, other, resources if we don't have water that we can grow that. If people have to leave their community to go get work, then, this starts to break down, the security and the function of a family. And people should be able to stay and work in their home communities. And so by creating good jobs that people can stay in their communities, it's good for the economy across BC. And in the end, it creates better and safer communities. And the last piece I would say on this is, one of the consistent messages that we continue to hear from the province is that there's just no money to do this work. Well, this is a clear opportunity that's really just rooted in fairness for the province to generate revenue that can then be dedicated back into this work that we know creates really positive benefits.
Mhm. Kyle, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, definitely seconding a lot of what Corey's saying around the investments that our provinces making around these new projects to, of course, like ensure our economic sovereignty. All these projects rely on sustainable water flows, and so I think there's always that part. But even thinking back or thinking about, at least for me, based in Vancouver, and I can look outside and see how low snow we have, and I think this winter has been a good example of just like how strange. Like I think the predictable wet BC that I think many of us have lived in for many years is changing, and I think that we need to have the systems to address this change. Last year we had floods in the Lower Fraser. We've had droughts up in the Northeast, where Dawson Creek has had to look at $100 million pipeline for their drinking water, and so again, we're existing in both of these extremes. And we feel really lucky where, Quebec made their change a few years ago, and we have this successful example. We have solutions on the table that, again, rooted in this like core fairness kind of value, I think that Corey was talking about. Like we can make these changes.
Awesome, thanks, Kyle. And this sort of ties a little bit into something that Corey was saying about the government saying like, we just don't have the money for it. And someone did ask a question in the Q&A about what the general response from the province has been on the report that the Watershed Security Coalition put out.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's been a lot of conversations that have happened with the province by our coalition and our members over the past several months, and like all in all, I would say that many people are quite shocked. Like many of our elected officials are quite shocked when they learn how little the province is charging, and it's been quite a positive response. And I think that there's an interest and a desire to explore what this means. And, we have heard from the Ministry of Waterland and Resource Stewardship that our report has been used as part of their review, their 10-year review, as they look at the Water Sustainability Act, which houses the water rates legislation in BC, and they're using that as a way to explore, okay, what are the opportunities here and what's possible. So I would say there's positive, it's landing quite positively. We're seeing, momentum. And so, yeah, we're feeling hopeful, and we'll just continue to keep that pressure up and keep meeting with, local MLAs and ministers to talk to them about this important opportunity.
Thanks, Corey. I'm going to jump to a question from Zita, who asked about if there's been any report or feedback, perhaps from Quebec's implementation of an increase in water rates.
Yeah, that's a great question. I thank you for the question, Zita. Um, we have had conversations with the group in Quebec that was really a part of bringing together many of the industries and the conservation groups that effectively pushed and lobbied for this work to happen in Quebec. And I'm not aware of a specific report that has been released. And Kyle, please correct me if I'm wrong on that from the conversations you've had as well. But what we do know is that one of the big things that came out of the work in Quebec is that industry, they want to be active active members of community, and they want to show that they are doing their part. And there were many industries that were, standing alongside other conservation organizations saying, yes, this is something that needs to happen. And my understanding is that some of the work happening in Quebec, they're actively working to continue to increase the rates on industry year over year as well.
Yeah, yeah. The only thing I'd add is as the rates were only changed in Quebec in 2024, they're still going through their there's still like a bit of a timeline adjustment that needs to happen to fully have the funds, the revenue generated to go into the Blue Fund, which is their kind of watershed security funding mechanism, and then the reports from that. So no, nothing's come out yet, but yeah, like Corey had said, like they're already thinking about pushing it further, and BC will only fall further behind unless we act now.
Thanks, Corey. Thanks, Kyle. Hopefully that answers your question, um, Zeta. I see a question from Spencer, and then I also see Wayne that you have your hand up. I'm gonna go for the question from Spencer first, and then Wayne, we can have you unmute after that. So Spencer asks that this might not be a big hit to the cost for large mines, but how about small farmers who work in the arid regions of our province? Has this been looked into and how it may impact them relative to their costs?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for that, Spencer. And it's definitely something we were quite conscious of as we were pulling this report together. And one of the things that we have really tried to emphasize, and we're only focusing on increases to large industrial users right now in the province. We're not recommending that water rates for farmers, municipalities be increased, and because we understand that there's a really hard time right now for food producers and other agriculture producers, and the cost of living in British Columbia is continuing to go up, and so we can't have those cost increases being put down back onto everyday people and those trying to run their small businesses. And so yeah, primarily focusing on large industrial users. The other thing we definitely took into consideration are around some of the small businesses or small industrial users as well. And in BC, we already have sort of this minimum threshold for smaller users, and so there's a lot of users who only pay $200 a year for the water that they do use. And even if BC were to apply Quebec's rates, who has some thresholds around, minimum amounts of water that are used on sort of a daily basis. But even if BC were to match Quebec, the majority, like 70 to 80% of small industrial users in the province wouldn't pay more than the $200 that they're already paying right now.
Thanks, Corey. Spencer, I hope that answered your question. And if you do have any follow-ups, you're welcome to pop those into the Q&A or the chat, where you can raise your hand. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, but we do have Wayne who has his hand up. So Wayne, I will allow you to unmute yourself, and then you're welcome to add any question or comment you may have.
Thank you. Thanks, Erica, for what you're doing from the Federation, and Corey and Kyle. Obviously, a righteous fight here. Two questions, or maybe one question and an observation. Have you talked to UBCM? Can you remind me? Have we talked to the Union of BC municipalities? Because they are far-reaching. Obviously, they have every mayor regional district that's in there, and they also have an environmental department, which I found to be, choosing my words carefully, uninvolved. But have we talked with these people?
Yeah, hi Wayne, lovely to hear your voice. And yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, we have. So UBCM, I mentioned a resolution was brought forward by the Village of Cumberland at the last UBCM in October, which was passed. And that resolution called on the province to modernize industrial water rates and then dedicate a portion back into communities. So that is on UBCM's radar, and yes, we're in conversations with members of the coalition, local government members of the coalition, with executive members and committee members at UBCM around industrial water rates and the opportunity around local watershed planning and boards. So those conversations are active. There's an interest and a desire and a demonstrated priority and commitment through the resolutions connected to this work.
Thanks. I have had some chance to educate a couple of regional districts and mayors, and I was amused that the regional district of Baltimore had a meeting with the Minister of Walrus and with Rio Tinto in the room, and put forward the two slides that you demonstrated between Quebec and British Columbia. Rio Tinto was slightly aghast. The minister was slightly amused, but they drove their point across there and had, she promised, good uptake on it. So we have tried to do our part up here.
That's great. Thank you for that. Thanks for that update, Wayne.
And good luck.
Awesome. Thanks, Wayne. If you don't have any more questions, I will. Oh, I see you've muted yourself. That is great. Okay, we had a follow-up question from Spencer, who was asking about how this may impact farm users. They are asking what are the main types of watershed projects that the additional funds would be going towards? They're sort of looking for just a brief overview of that.
Yeah, great question. Great follow-up, Spencer. So, one of the places that we recommended that some of this new revenue could go is in growing the Watershed Security Fund, and some of the work that we're already seeing the Watershed Security Fund supporting as it builds upon projects that have been funded through the Healthy Watersheds Initiative and the Indigenous Watersheds Initiative, focuses around watershed planning and governance and collaboration at the local level, but it's also supporting watershed restoration projects, building wetlands, repairing wetlands, work that the watershed team at BCWF does, and that obviously ties into, restoring some of the critical natural infrastructure in our province, and looking at how, we can ensure that we have, effective water supply for foods, supporting our food systems and food security in the province. And I think a big part of this also is connected to our monitoring, right, and assessment, and so that we can make better decisions when we actually know how, either how much water we have, but also what is the impact of the work that is happening on the ground. And then the other key piece where there's a huge opportunity and where we're seeing some of the investments to date are really around land and water-based learning and intergenerational knowledge that's supporting either partnerships between nations and projects, but also within nations, that intergenerational learning and planning and opportunities to get on the land. So those are some of the sort of key themes and sort of funding buckets right now that we see. But yeah, hope that helps to answer. If you want to know more specifically on the Watershed Security Fund, they've on the website, they sort of break down some of the funding buckets there.
Yeah, and Lena sent in the chat a link to the Watershed Security Fund's website showing some of the projects that they've funded. And as Corey said, the BC Wildlife Federation, our watershed team, has been funded under the Watershed Security Fund before. And if you do want to learn more about the sort of projects that we do for watershed restoration, you can check out our website, or we're also going to be going a little bit more in depth in some of the projects that we do on our in our webinar on February 18th. So you can come learn about those there. There's two questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to kind of merge them a little bit. The first one's from Douglas, who also sent a message in the chat about clear cutting, and Douglas's question is sort of around advocacy. So what are the next steps that we both the royal we and then maybe even we as individuals can take to force change in Victoria and with the province. And then Zita has a question that I'll sort of tack on to that of where have you heard any pushback on these topics?
Okay, so I just want to make sure that I've got the questions straight here. So the first one is just around some of the you said there was maybe a question in the chat here. Sorry.
Yeah, Douglas put a question in the chat around the continued clear cutting of forests and those the impacts on watersheds from this, and should corporations be charged for these impacts, and then followed up in the Q&A. Sorry, Douglas, we must have missed your question in the chat originally about um, how could we force change in Victoria to around the adequacy of these topics and to force change towards better watershed security. I think that's what Douglas is getting at, but feel free, Douglas, to correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, we'll go with that.
Yeah.
And Kyle, please feel free to jump in on any of these. I think that there is a lot happening on there's a lot happening on the landscape in BC right now in the province, and I think in parts of the province we are seeing some important land use planning processes that are happening between nations and the province and conservation organizations and other key stakeholders that are part of those planning processes. And these are important processes that are happening as the province looks to like move forward. One of the things I think when we look at it from like a watershed perspective is, and this ties into some of the watershed management and governance work that, as a coalition that we've been advocating around, a better system of watershed governance across the province that could look like watershed boards in some communities, but creating, one of the big things is like, how do we ensure that have the framework and that communities have the tools to be able to come together to determine the priorities for their communities, and be able to then come up with the plans as to like how they can move towards that. And so when we think about some of the clear cutting and we think about some of the other major, industrial projects that are moving forward, it's critically important from a systems perspective that local communities have a say in what is happening, and that the proper consultation and engagement with nations is happening as this work is moving forward as well. And so, as the world and global uncertainty continues to sort of feel like it's increasing, it feels more and more important that we're bringing it back to the local at this time. And I think one of the things as like British Columbians that we can be doing is having these conversations, talking with our neighbors about, what you're learning, what you're hearing, opportunities right now in the province, connecting with your local electeds, your MLAs and your members of parliament, and having these conversations with them, so that the more that people are hearing from their constituents, we continue to build up that political pressure and that knowledge. I think that's a really important thing right now, is that we're continuing to elevate these issues in the bigger conversation that's happening. You know,
And just to add on that, if that's okay, Corey, just in the chat, I've just added a link to call your MLA, which is through the Watershed Security website. We've had over 2,000 British Columbians send letters to their MLAs, and nearly 250 British Columbians make phone calls or to their MLA's offices. And so, especially with the budget, which is going to be released on February 17th, we're like really kind of building up to this moment to really make sure that our MLAs um, make sure that this is a priority for British Columbians. I think the second thing I'd add here is what we can be doing is, I mean, I'm really grateful that there's 27 people in this room that listen to us talk for nearly an hour about watershed rates, and yet we recognize that maybe that's not everyone wants to spend their Wednesday afternoons. And so we also have this minute and a half, way punchier video, which I've shared on Instagram, which is like also a great tool to be used to send to exactly Erica, like your dad that wants the elevator pitch. This is, I think, a packaged elevator pitch that you can send. And so I think those are two big things that we can do to kind of push for this, I think, in the budget.
Yeah, I will say that video that you put out was very well done. Our coworker Janie sent it to us last week, and I was very impressed. I really liked it. So congratulations on that. Corey, was there any last pieces that you wanted to add on that at all?
Um, I think maybe just the last thing I would add that I think is important, like given some of these bigger, the bigger discourse and conversation that is happening is like just again reinforcing that piece around the health of our watersheds really as foundational to a lot of the success right now, and that it's really interconnected. Um, and I think as we're seeing, you know, regulations being cut and projects being fast tracked, and just the other day, we learned that the province is planning to halt their the legislation to make polluters pay to like clean up after themselves when they finish a project. This is a moment that we have to continue to like uphold the health and prosperity of our communities for today, but really for future generations as well. Because if we don't, like, we as British Columbians are the ones that are left holding the price tag, whether it's the next crisis that needs to be responded to. And so this is just a really proactive and fiscally responsible way that we can start to prioritize what is ultimately keeping our community safe and healthy.
Yeah. Um, okay, we have a few more questions, and I'm just looking at the time. We're not gonna have enough time for all of them. So I'm going to give you two questions, and there's a chance that you might be able to answer both of them, and then we'll have to end it there. So Zita asked whether, and I think you've already touched on this a little bit, so maybe you have a shorter answer for it, where you've heard any pushback on maybe some of the advocacy work and campaigning that the coalition has done, and pushback around just modernizing water rates in general. And then Rory asked, what effect does something like the renegotiation of the Columbia River Treaty have on this?
Okay. Well, what I would say is that where have we heard pushback? I would say the most pushback, if we could call it pushback, is around competitiveness, right? And so that's often where people's minds go to is like, oh, but what about competitiveness? And so that is obviously, we spoke about that in our presentation, and one of the things that we're trying to help to demystify for folks. And so I think that's where continuing to just like share the facts that this is about large industrial users, getting on par with like other provinces, and where these changes like are well below those material thresholds, I think is the big thing to keep emphasizing there. But that is the biggest push is around are people, are these large industries not going to want to invest in British Columbia? And I hope, and I think that we've been able to counter that argument with the research and the work that we've been doing to showcase sort of the opportunity right now. And then, sorry, there was another question. Sorry, I'm going one question at a time in my head.
Yeah, no,
Kyle, oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
It is 1 o'clock, so this was the end of our webinar, so people are welcome to go. But if you do have time to maybe answer this last question from Rory, that would be good. Rory was just asking, what effect does something like the renegotiation of the Columbia River Treaty have on this?
Yeah, I mean, in short, like I'm not an expert on the negotiations of the Columbia River Treaty, but in short, I would just say that we aren't talking about hydro or electrical rates when it comes to like the water licensing system. So so from that perspective, I don't see an impact there, but yeah, I don't know that I can speak to sort of the rest of the negotiations that are happening with the Columbia River Treaty right now.
I think the only thing I'd add is, at least for me, my reaction when hearing of like how Canada could be this tap, it really made me feel like, oh yeah, actually, our waters are really worth defending. Like this is a really integral part about being a British Columbian, about being a Canadian, is our nature, is our landscapes, and our water. And so I think to me, it's like this further trigger of like, yeah, we really do need to be investing in like the monitoring and like maintenance of our watersheds. And so, although it's not connected, I think there's like a core feeling around how we're or at least how I feel about the prospect of renegotiations of the Columbia Water Treaty.
See, Corey, you're answering Douglas's question now. I was just typing out a message, but thank you for answering him in the Q&A. Wow, running these webinars always requires my brain to be bouncing to many a different place. But thank you, Kyle and Corey, so much, and thank you everybody for joining us today. And like I said, we have recorded this. Alana, maybe if you want to stop the recording. We have been recording this webinar and we will post